Thank you. So yes, my name's Bronson, and I'll be talking about what Peter said. So let's talk about the problem that I'm going to try and talk about that we need to solve. So what often happens when you're starting a project, you'll have a team of developers who have opinions about what environment they like to use. So you'll have some that like Docker, you'll have some that like XAMPP, WAMP, there'll be VVV, which stands for Varying Vagrant Vagrants, which is commonly used in the WordPress community. Now the main issue here is if you don't have a consistent development environment, then you can have difficulty onboarding developers, which is obviously a cost to the business. It also can be frustrating when you just want to get in and help your team member out, but they've got a different environment. So they might be running a different version of PHP on their machine. Or it's just, essentially you would like to have a consistent development environment across your team. So what I'm going to try and introduce to you is a new concept where you actually use version control to version control your development environment. So the solution is, well, something that Ryan McHugh and I have engineered over time, and it's based on Vagrant. And essentially, we have a really lightweight Vagrant system that has various different types of PHP that you can install. You can install extensions to change the server environment and essentially try and get it to match your production environment as close as possible. And by doing this too, you obviously have everyone in your team is using the same environment, so it's easy to onboard. You can have documentation about how someone gets up and going, and they can hit the ground running really quickly. So rather than spending a few days to try and set up a development environment, you can have them up and running within, say, half an hour or so. But how? Well, we've created this Vagrant-based environment called Chassis. And Chassis is as lean as possible. So we've taken a lot of the things from various other projects that we like. So obviously you're going to have similar technologies. You're going to need PHP. You're going to need a database, so MySQL. You're going to need a web server. So in this case, Nginx is our choice rather than Apache. And we've also made it so that we can ship different and configure different versions of PHP. So Chassis can be configured to use anything from PHP 5.3 all the way up to 7.1. Now, the good thing about that is if you know your development environment is going to be using PHP version 7, you can commit a configuration file with that PHP version in there. When your developer goes to run their environment and get set up, you know that it's going to match production. So you're not going to hit any weird edge case bugs with different versions of PHP and things like that. So essentially, the default chassis, which is if you pull down this from GitHub, actually I should go back. I've got a link down the bottom, chassis.io, which will take you to the documentation. We've got all the code version controlled on GitHub. So the basic setup we have is Chassis out of the box. If you clone it down and run Vagrant up, you'll end up with Nginx running, you'll have MySQL running, and the default PHP version we've got it locked to at the moment is version 7. Now, essentially, what happens is you'll clone down the repository and you'll run this command, Vagrant up. And for those of you who are a little bit scared of the command line, you don't need to be in this case because it's basically all automated, so you can just see it working its magic. Now, what will happen over the next 5 minutes of this video? You're essentially going from no development environment to having a development environment up and running with WordPress installed and configured to log in 5 minutes. So it's super fast. And essentially, what happens is you'll start with the base Ubuntu image. It'll install various versions of PHP. It'll set that up. It'll configure them. And it's all done in minutes. So this is stuff that normally a sysadmin or sysops person would do themselves. And this is just totally automated. So it'll slowly pull in packages, set up Ruby, it'll just grab everything. And essentially what you end up with is a working development environment on your machine and on all of your other developers' machines that matches. And it's super simple. You can also do things like install extensions, which I'm going to go into later. So for example, if you're a developer, most of us will use Xdebug, which gives us we can basically put breakpoints in our code to see what values are being interpreted by the computer and like find bugs in our codes and things like that. What we use under the hood is a tool called Puppet, and it's for provisioning. So essentially what Puppet does is you tell it, hey, I want these packages and versions of PHP, MySQL to be installed and set, and it'll basically look at what's on the computer and go, okay, do I have this? Yes or no? If I don't, then I'll go about finding that and setting it up. So if any of you have played around at the command line before, you'll be used to doing things like apt get install package name, and it'll go and grab a package and set it up. Then you probably have to restart your server, or you'll have to say, do that, then restart a PHP service to make sure that it's running. All these things that are really tedious and quite difficult to do. This is all automated here. So see, we've got MySQL client there, we've got Git core. Now we're just actually downloading and installing MySQL, so it will get set up. A few things like Python, which is required by different technologies. Avahi, so if you've set up a development environment before, you might be used to doing things like editing your host file to put in an IP address and then pointing it. All these things that are really super fiddly. What we've done for here, we've used Avahi, which is essentially, you just give it a domain, so whatever domain .local, and it'll automatically know where to look for that IP address because there's some smarts that were built in there. We installed WP CLI as well because most of us will use that for quite a lot of things like importing a database or running scripts, doing massive import exports and things like that. So now you'll see we're grabbing all the common PHP 7 packages, so MB string, CLI, PHP FEM, zip, XML. Just essentially, if you go to the WordPress specification page about what's required for a minimum kind of install of WordPress, these are all the packages that you need, so we've looked after those for you. Essentially, there's a few more things it'll do. XML, I'm nearly there. 5 minutes is a long time when you're up here. So essentially what we've done, by the end of this, we'll have our own WordPress server set up locally, ready to log in with WordPress installed. So the famous 5-minute install is actually taking 5 minutes here, but you're also setting up a server from scratch too in that 5 minutes. So it's nearly done now. There's a few files there that you might be familiar with, like PHP INI. You'll often be customizing that one yourself. We ship our own version of that that's got some sensible defaults. GD, image library, and curl, of course, because we can't go without curl to make our HTTP requests. MySQL, PHP FEM, you'll see there's a refresh there, so that's just re-triggering services to say, hey, I've installed packages. Make those work. Nginx for our web server so that we can serve web pages. And we're nearly there. Send mail, because, hey, we need to send email, of course. And a few more configuration files that we've got. And boom, it tells you your chassis box has been provisioned. So if I went to that HTTP vagrant.local, I would see a default WordPress site like so. And it's all just happened behind the scenes. So this is a default folder structure. So one of the things that we do with Chassis is we believe that you should never hack WordPress core, which hopefully everyone knows you shouldn't do that now. But we also believe that that shouldn't be inside your version control on GitHub. We believe that everything that you would normally have in your WP content folder, like themes, plugins, and things like that, that should be version controlled. So what we do, rather than using WP content, we have a folder there called content, which you can see. So on a default Chassis install for a new team, you'd pull down Chassis, you'd get it set up like so. You'd create the content folder, then inside that content folder you'd do git.init, so you initialize a new Git repository, then do probably git add dot to add all the things that are in there, then commit message, then you'd push that up to GitHub, then you'd slowly start working on your project. Then your team will also be committing to that repository as well, and they'll be using that inside the Chassis box. So you'll see we've got a folder called WP there, which is obviously WordPress. Inside that you'd see normal folders that you used to, like WP admin, WP includes, things like that. I've got a few extra files that are automatically generated, so these local config files. You can actually put in some constants there yourself. So we've got an example file there, just like WordPress usually has wp-config.sample. We've followed their pattern there, and got a local config.sample that you can copy and paste and put in any sensible custom constants that you want to define. Because we've got this as a development environment, we've got some smart defaults in there. So like WP debug is set to true, WP debug log is on, and a few other things like that. We've also got logs. So what happens there, you've got shared folders on Vagrant. So essentially you have a folder that's inside your development machine and also on your environment, and they're synced. So if you're getting error logs and things, if you've ever had to hunt them down on a server, it's usually quite painful, and you've got to remember, or is it like / etc. somewhere, and you're trying to find them around. So what we've done is synced both your Nginx and PHP logs into those log folders, so when you're hitting errors and you want to debug them or just see access logs, you can just browse on your own computer rather than inside the development machine. We've also got the concept of extensions, and this is where Chassis really comes into shine. So we've kept it lightweight, but you can also add whatever extensions you like. So think of extensions like plugins, but for your development environment. So for example, here's a whole bunch of extensions that we've written. So if you like any of these, using any of these things, or need to use any of these type of tools for your development environment, you can add those with these extensions. They'll automatically get provisioned and set up and work like magic. So you don't need to know any of the server tech behind it and just how to use them. So there's a few examples there. PHP Code Sniffer, which if you use code sniffing, it's wonderful for your WordPress core. So you can find out, am I escaping things properly? Am I using, I don't think it does tabs or spaces, but it really should, shouldn't it? It can find out all sorts of different things that you're doing wrong, automatically make you look like a better developer than you are because it's finding these things out before your colleagues do it. See the code review. You've got Grunt, which is commonly used for doing all sorts of things, automating general day-to-day tasks, can compile SAS files into CSS, it can minify JavaScript, do all sorts of crazy things with that. Node.js, usually used by a lot of these other technologies here. Excuse me. Gulp, you've probably heard of. Yarn, Xdebug is my favorite just because I love live putting breakpoints in my code and finding out what the hell's going on rather than just var dumping on the page. BBPress VIP Classic, so if any of you people need to work on VIP projects, if you're an agency or you're contracted to a VIP agency who's doing work there, that sets it up so that you've got a very .com, WordPress.com-like infrastructure on your development environment, which is great for testing. PHPMyAdmin, if you like using that, we've got an extension for that. WebGrind is fantastic for profiling your PHP code. Cavalcade is a human-made plugin that's basically like WP cron but done properly. Memcache, if you want to actually, if you have Memcache on your server, which you pretty much will, and sometimes you can hit odd caching bugs there, so you can install Memcache and let it work. Generator is just a little thing that can automatically generate a configuration file for Chassis, so it'll ask you questions about PHP version numbers and things like that and give you a file at the end. Mailhog, I'll go into later on. It's fantastic. It essentially captures any mail that's sent via your WordPress machine, which if you've used other things before, you've probably had to set up mail to send and it'll go to your real email address. We catch this in a web browser. Theme review, so if you ever review themes on WordPress.org, we've got all the plugins there. Debugging, sets up a whole bunch of debugging plugins. ImageMagick, Query Monitor, which is great. Composer, which you'd probably be used to using for PHP packages. SQL Pro, we've got an extension there so you can type Vagrant SQL and it'll automatically open up and connect to your database. Local dev, just so you can see whether you're on local or live. Mcrypt, Vow, and Tester. Last of all, Tester is quite important if you're doing PHP unit tests. We pull down WP Develop, which is Chunk for WordPress, and we set it up and configure that so that you can run tests against that. Okay. So essentially, talk about a custom project. So I've just created, well, I haven't just, I did create a custom project earlier on for a demonstration to show how this works. So essentially, if you go to that repository and pull that down into an existing Chassis project and run Vagrant provision, some magic will happen, but I'll just quickly go through the file. So the main file there we've got is this config.yaml file. Now, this is how we configure the variables for chassis. It's just a really easy human-readable format to change some different variables. So in chassis itself, there's a config.yaml file which you can copy and paste into your project and change different things there. It's all well documented, but I've just picked a few different examples here. So out of the box, normally it would be vagrant.local for your host. I've changed that to wordcamp.local. Database username, password, and prefix, I've just changed those so you can see how that happens. Also, admin configuration, so you can configure your own username and password and things like that. Because this is development, normally just by default we have admin and password because you're not pushing it live, you're just using it locally. Then extensions. So I picked a few of my favorite extensions there. So MailHog, which I will demonstrate shortly. Xdebug, which I use with PHP Storm to debug my tester for unit tests. Composer, Grunt, and also importantly, PHP version 7.1. So what happens when you pull this repository down, you get this file, and you run vagrant provision. Now what will happen, this is a lot faster than the other one. Essentially what happens when this happens is Chassis will have a look and go, okay, have you given me any new configuration options since I last provisioned this environment? And Chassis will go, yeah, there are some different ones here. So I've got a whole bunch of extensions there that I don't have. So I'm going to go and find those now and pull those down from GitHub. So it starts by doing that. And you'll see tester, all the different repositories, it's just automatically pulled in from GitHub. So it saves having to do git clone manually into your extensions folder. Develop takes a while because it's WordPress core and there's a lot of stuff in there. Essentially what happens after this is then Puppet will have a look through and go, okay, you've said PHP version 7.1, let me have a look what I've got installed currently. Oh, hang on, it's actually version 7, we don't want that. So we'll change that. So what it'll do, it will remove that version of PHP 7 and then install PHP version 7.1. Now the beauty of this is your YAML file is committed into your repository, so it's version controlled. So your version controls your development environment. So when a developer comes on board, you can simply say, here's our repository, pull that down, use clone chassis, run vagrant up, and out of the box, it will set it up and match it to PHP version 7 with all these different extensions and database logins, and everything's just there in version control, which is really quite different because you can imagine everyone would normally probably have their own version of WordPress, their own username, their own password. So even just trying to walk over or remote video call if you're remote with a coworker to troubleshoot something, they'll be using a different user. Things will be different. So here you've got this consistency. So you can see now that wdevelop is getting set up. MailHog's getting done, PHP units being pulled down for tester. And it'll get there eventually. Essentially, yeah, you're going to have everyone on your team using the same development environment, and it really saves a lot of time to get set up and running. Just wait for it. I might just skip it. I know it'll finish. Okay. So this is MailHog. So this is a really cool extension. So mentioning this one before. So in the past, say you're working on an e-commerce site, for example. Think about the amount of email that's getting sent and the things you're trying to test with email during that. So for example, someone makes an order. There's usually an invoice is fired out, or someone's set up a new customer account. Things like this. Which when you're developing, if you're actually having to go and check your email for these things, it takes a long time. And also getting that configured can be quite difficult. So with Chassis and the MailHog extension, you can see that I've got my custom domain, wordcamp.local, and then there's a port number there. So if you're using MailHog and the Chassis extension, whatever domain you have, you can just add that port number 8025. Anytime WordPress sends an email, you'll get caught in there, so you can debug it there. It's quite handy. Went a bit fast. So talk a little bit about a roadmap that we've got ahead for chassis. So this project's been around for, goodness, how many years? A long time. Probably 4, you reckon? Yeah, I'll probably go longer. Anyway, 4 or 5 years, so it's well established and it's solid. We always maintain it. What we've got coming up is one of the main bits of feedback we have is a lot of people don't like the command line, which is fair enough. I'd never used to, and it took me a while to get used to it. So what we're trying to do is actually we are doing is writing a little app that you can use to control and provision chassis. From that, so that the barrier to entry is quite low and change the environment. You don't even have to configure any of these YAML things that might look foreign to some of you. You'll just have a visual app where you can do this. Another thing we want to do, because a lot of people are using Docker. Now, Docker is known to be quite fast. So my 5-minute provisioning would seem slow to some Docker people. But what we're actually going to do is we're going to build a base image to make this even leaner. So a base image of chassis will sit on your server, on your local machine. Anytime you do a new version of chassis, it'll check if that box exists. If it does, it'll provision from that. And essentially, if you think about the version-controlled variables that I was talking about, it'll check against that and go, okay, I've already got everything else. I only need to kind of do the diff. So it'll be even faster after that. I'd also like to introduce deleted extensions. So at the moment, if you add an extension, provision it, it's going to be on there, but there's no way to actually get rid of that extension. So we're going to have another option to delete extensions as well. So a bit of a look at sneak peek of the chassis desktop beta. It's going to look like that, a little bit like this. So you can actually download the beta of this. So it'll show you all the different chassis boxes that you have installed. You can start and stop them. From the interface, you can also see that this is how we're going to enable you to use multi-site or change your version of PHP, hit refresh, and off you go. So I was going to do an Xdebug extension. How much have I got? 10 minutes. No, probably not. No, I might go for questions because it's quite an interesting topic and a lot of people have different questions. So let's go straight into the questions, if that's cool. Any questions? Okay. Yeah, so essentially what I end up doing, the Xdebug extension especially, if I go to, let me see. I've got it here. So essentially we've got, can you see that? No, we cannot. So mirroring. Try one. Cool. So this one here is an Xdebug extension that's specifically designed for PHP Storm. So once you have listed the extension, I lost a mic. Once you've listed this extension and installed it, essentially it'll go through and it'll change add any file, which is specific for PHP Storm, and it'll configure that. Then essentially you'll see that I've got a little setup guide here. So there's a helper plugin that you can use with Chrome if you're a Chrome user. I think they've got one for Firefox too. You install that, change these settings here. So your IDE key, you can see, is PHP Storm. Set that one up. And then I've also got where you have to map. So for my example would be wordcamp.local. I'd set that up there. Then also the main thing here is your absolute path is Vagrant. Hit OK. Then you can see in PHP Storm you click this button here, and then essentially refresh in your browser. PHP Storm will listen, automatically detect if you've got a breakpoint. You've got that set, it'll pick it up and off you go. So it's actually, really, really cool. I couldn't live without it. Now, I used to var dump everywhere, and that's been my best friend.
Can you change the PHP version on an existing box and reprovision?
Sure can. Yep. So you can go up and down versions, and just Vagrant provision, and it'll go, all right, what am I now? What should I be? And it'll change it. So you do that back and forth? Yep. Yep, sure. Yep, you can go up and down as much as you like, and it'll just automatically go back. The only issue we had, we couldn't seem to get it to work with PHP 5.2, but you can go 5.3, 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, 7, but yeah, there you go. Yeah, so essentially, yeah, up and down as much as you like, and that's another reason why we wanted to do it, because as plugin developers, we've got these different versions that we need to support, and there's usually unusual quirks. So being able to quickly just change that, Vagrant and start saves a lot of time and messing around.
Bronson asked a question about the development build to say like that's off from scratch. Say if you've got obviously a code base, you've got a database, you've got file systems, could you incorporate that into the camp build as well?
You can. What we've got to kind of make it so that you can port it into an old project, got what we've called paths, which is here. It's got quite a bit of documentation on various things. So we've got essentially paths. So you can have chassis in a folder, and then change the path to whatever your other project is, and then go Vagrant provision, and chassis will be smart enough to pick that up and do its magic. So you can use that for there. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so that way, yeah, we tried to make it backwards compatible because that was one of the things where we're like, oh, we've got old projects too, how can we make it work with that? So that's our kind of workaround for that.
Do you have any recommendations on merging, handling database changes between developers? Like you have to...
Yeah, so that one, my favorite option at the moment is WP Migrate DB Pro, if you've heard of that plugin. Essentially, you can sync your database environments, and it essentially does a diff to see what's changed between different versions. Yeah, so WP Migrate DB Pro. They're also the team from Delicious Brains, it is, that make that. They're working on a product called MergeBot. So I think it's mergebot.com. And that's going to be something very similar, but they're doing like a cloud version of that, so that if you have multiple developers doing database changes, it's all going to sync to this cloud. Then you can replay and like do a diff from the cloud across all your environments, which is pretty incredible stuff. It's I think it's in beta at the moment, but it's coming along really well. But yeah, that's the solution. Any other questions? Yep. No, it's just essentially, it's what we've done inside Chassis is you can actually define a custom content directory in WordPress. I think it's WP_content_URL or dir or something like that. Essentially what we do is say, rather than using WP content, just use our content. So it looks up there. So everything in there, just, yeah. Yep. Yep. One question up the back. Mostly just for sync folders, like synchronizing. Yeah, it's built into Vagrant, so it's kind of doing that behind the scenes. Yeah.
Really cool. Actually, extremely impressed with the amount of tools you got in there. And
Awesome.
putting in
Thank you. I only did that recently because I was looking at XProf, but it wasn't compatible with PHP 7, and then Ryan had to go at trying to make that work and couldn't get it to work. So I'm like, it's got to be something else, and yeah, it's in there now.
Yeah, great talk, thank you. I'm a big fan of VVV, and I've only just actually this week started to use Chassis.
Mm-hmm.
I've got one project in Chassis.
Mm-hmm.
VVV, when I add extra projects, you would have one instance of
Mm-hmm.
VVV and then just add additional sites at the same
Yep.
time. In Chassis, would you have a Chassis instance for each project?
Yeah, so I should have explained the rationale behind that. So our major concern there was that when you've got something like VVV and you have all of these projects in one place, essentially you've got one point of failure there, right, across multiple projects. So if something goes wrong, you accidentally destroy it, you've lost all of these projects. So our rationale is that like each project should have its own chassis so that it's one point of failure essentially. So yeah, essentially you can also just destroy it and re-up it and not be worried about losing things, losing the whole lot. So yeah, that's our main thing. We were a biggest concern was A, it's quite big and bloated and you're going to end up with a massive database with all these different sites, and B, yeah, one point of failure. So if one thing messes up, you've lost all your projects, which is horrible. So it's just kind of isolating that risk into one project. It's one of our main reasons for choosing that. But obviously, yeah, we've got options for multi-site. So if you do multi-site with chassis, that .local extension, like it can automatically pick up subdomains and things like that. So it's good for multi-site too. Any more questions?